A white silk dress, a crimson tear, the chandeliers scattered light like falling snow, crystal pendants chimed as if the room itself inhaled. Orchids, arranged in winter sprays, leaned over long tables where linen folded like a promise. A string quartet skated through carols. Every face in the grand ballroom was polished to the same winter gloss, until a single, deliberate motion split the evening. Jasmine Washington was moving through that gloss as if she were air, efficient, nearly invisible, practiced in the art of not getting in anyone's way. She wore the standard server's black, a sheath cut from sturdy fabric, sensible shoes, apron, not a dress chosen for a ball, but for the work she did through the holiday season to keep her rent and her mother's medicines paid. She had waited on the city's wealthiest families throughout her summers and winters, memorizing polite smiles and the particularities of fine china. She had learned to make herself small in rooms built to make others feel big. Tonight, she belonged to the room in function, not in claim. Victoria Hartwell belonged to the room in a different currency. Victoria belonged to glassware and legacy, to a lineage of invitations and photo margins. Her gown was the color of late December snow, silk stitched so fine it might have whispered when she walked. Her hair caught the chandelier's light and refracted it into just enough sparkle to make her a miniature sun. She moved through the crowd with the authority of someone for whom the word no merely meant not yet. It was a small cruelty at first, an aside meant for the people like her, a joke to fold the lower halves of the room into their proper place. Victoria had been gliding through the tables when she saw Jasmine. The look she gave the server was two things, amusement and decision. She reached out slow, theatrical, her fingers, manicured and cold, closed on the fabric at Jasmine's hip and tore. A seam surrendered with a soft, startling sound. Silk split. The white of Victoria's gown and the black of Jasmine's dress collided, white flourishing red from the glass Victoria had with a laugh that was a weapon, used to smear wine across the torn place like a signature. The crimson bloomed, a red that read astonishingly like a punctuation mark across both fabric and night. Cameras, not official ones, but the little recorders people keep in their pockets, lifted, whispering, inhaled the room. Silence flooded after the rip, not the silence of shock only, but of a social automatic catching of breath, the kind of hush that isolates the one on whom attention is fixed. Some faces were frozen in the currency of their class. Others had the private flash of discomfort that only human beings feel when cruelty becomes public art. Margaret Wellington and Patricia Whitmore, two of Victoria's usual companions, pressed smiles thin as paper and muttered to each other about the audacity, as though the audacity belonged to Jasmine and not to Victoria.
Jasmine felt the tear like heat against her skin. She felt 300 eyes, and for a fraction of a second, the ballroom felt like a stage set her whole life had prepared her to serve. There was embarrassment, quick, knife-sharp for a moment, but it was not all she felt. Beneath the immediate shock was another muscle she had spent years building, composure. It had kept her from answering back in junior high when a teacher called on someone else. It had kept her from missing scholarship deadlines because she'd had to work a double shift. It kept her steady now. She covered the tear with her hand the way people do when they don't want others to see them break. Her fingers found the edge of the fabric and folded it, in a slow, practical motion. A server's hands, trained for clean plates and swift apologies, do not tremble for long. She stepped back to the tray she carried. The tray's weight anchored her like a statement. She offered the next glass as if nothing had happened. Polite, efficient, unassailable. People whispered. Someone murmured a sympathetic comment, but the room had already turned into a tribunal of the privileged, and the verdict was being rendered in tiny, corrosive glances. Victoria laughed. Not a full laugh, an edged sound meant to thin the air of any moral argument. "Can't you watch where you're going?" she said, loud enough for her table to hear and for cameras to catch the bite of it. She did not use the kinds of words that would be broadcasted on every feed. She used lighter ones that, delivered with a tilt and a smile, carried the weight of dismissal. The words were familiar to Jasmine, small humiliations disguised as common sense. Not slurs, not explicit hate, but the kind of language that stings because it reduces a person to the one thing the speaker deems smaller. Jasmine answered with a practiced politeness. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Let me—" She did not finish. Her mouth shut around the apology the way a bird's beak clumses against a storm. She had learned that apologies offered to the guilty are seldom accepted and often weaponized. Instead, she set the tray down, moved to the kitchen, and stepped through the swinging doors into the fluorescent calm of the service corridor. Back in the ballroom, the cameras tilted to catch the smear. A phone recorded the torn seam and the red smear like a tableau. The quartet continued to play, their notes slightly off,
like an image momentarily corrupted. Conversation resumed around the edges, lubricated by wine and the insistence of the evening that nothing truly terrible belonged to it. Victoria tittered as though the room had applauded her. For a place like hers, social cruelty had often paid off in the currency of stories told over hors d'oeuvres, stories that solidified belonging. Tonight, she had decided to make one. Jasmine put her back against a cool laundry chute and closed her eyes.
She let herself breathe in and out in counts she had learned in late-night drives back from the hospital, when the car's heater was the only thing holding the cold of the city away. She was 26. She had a scholarship acceptance letter framed in a shoebox under her childhood bed from DePaul, but she had saved, sacrificed, and moved east. A transfer to Harvard Business School, the last year of an MBA that felt both dream and ledger. She worked the ball because the internship arrangements and the unpaid summer projects required rent. Her mother needed the pharmacy plan coverage she had fought to afford. This was the calculus of the life she was building. Do the invisible labor today to earn the visible agency of tomorrow. She had something else in her pocket, something small and legal and steady, a digital recorder the size of a matchbox, a practice she had adopted months before as part of her thesis. Her work had not been abstract. It was a dissertation of small violences, microaggressions, tiny reprimands, negligent dehumanizations, the way polite language could be a net against a person's dignity, were the subjects she had chosen because she had lived them. In clinics and classrooms and corporate coffee bars, she had learned to listen and to collect. Her recordings were not meant to inflame but to show, to put measured evidence where otherwise there might be only memory and the word of the powerful. She crouched by the service door and thumbed the recorder, then slid it into the pocket stitched inside her apron. It sat there like a talisman. She checked herself in the small stainless steel sink, smoothing fabric, dabbing at the wine smear that had crept under Victoria's theatrics and stained a corner of her sleeve. She could have demanded an apology. She could have called security. She could have done 100 things in the heat of a moment. Instead, she chose the thing that would be useful later. Gather the fact, maintain the story. Out in the foyer, Robert Hartwell watched. He was not myths of the era made flesh. He was a man in a refined blazer, sleeves slightly too short from an old tailor who died, his face a careful assembly of good habit and inherited confidence. He had arrived at the ball with his wife because such things were part of Hartwell Development's public choreography. His company's name was on the building 2 blocks from where the orchestra warmed up. People expected his presence to be both public relations and proof, a millionaire husband who dealt in slabs of glass and land and promises. Robert noticed the torn fabric. He noticed the way Victoria, arranged the scene. But he noticed something else that was small and harder to translate, Jasmine's restraint. He watched her cross the room with a tray, with her shoulders set like an anchor. He saw the way she took herself out of the theater she had been forced into and moved like someone who had rehearsed patience a long time.
When the server's hand had braced the tear, Robert had seen too the slate flinch of the onlookers. He felt a hiccup of something like shame ride up his spine, a sensation as foreign to him as a cold draft through a sealed window. He had been raised to consider reputation like a thermostat, maintain it, and the climate of the company stays comfortable. He had never been accustomed to the fragility of human dignity cluttering up the ledger. But that evening, he felt it. Something about the slowness of Victoria's cruelty, how deliberate it was, how textured, hit him differently when held against Jasmine's quiet. He had a camera phone raised before the evening speeches even started, the reflex of a man who curates moments. He lowered it now, not to capture the smear, but because he was suddenly seeing the ripple his household could cause. For a moment he thought of branding and of apologies drafted by committees. He thought of the board and press releases and the 1,000 small actions a company could take to defend its name. He also thought, uncomfortably, of the conversations he had avoided with Victoria about charity and the optics of philanthropy. He felt his ribcage fill, like someone in a lit room who suddenly notices smoke. Jasmine, washing her hands, replayed the evening's motion in the small theater of her head. The recorder at her hip held more than a few minutes of the room's sound, Victoria's chuckle, the clink of silverware, the hushed commentary from the crowd. She had been wearing the recorder that night not to trap, but to remember. Part of her thesis argued that the accumulation of small harms shaped careers and lives as certainly as any overt act. Tonight, the accumulation had been made visible in a single violent gesture. She boiled the thought into a cold, strategic clarity. Evidence is something you present when you want an institution to listen. A torn dress without context risks being spun into a tale about a clumsy server. An audio clip paired with witness statements becomes a dossier. She thought of the months of her life cataloging remarks. You speak well for someone from where you're from. Is that your real name? And how those phrases, when strung together, made an architecture of slight against whole people.
The recorder was her architect's pencil. Back in the ballroom, Victoria navigated the aftermath with practiced indifference. She was already weaving the narrative she preferred: an unfortunate accident, a poor server who couldn't keep pace with an evening of celebration. Margaret and Patricia offered help in tones that were affectionate only toward one another. It was just a bit of theater, Margaret told a nearby photojournalist, as if theater absolved malice. The photographer, eager for an image, angled his lens toward the torn fabric. "A shame," Patricia said. "Poor thing." "Poor?" someone echoed, and the word hung like an accusation no one wanted to make audible. The guests slipped back into their roles.
The string quartet pivoted toward the next movement. The room smelled faintly of pine, and yet the air tasted metallic where the wine had been smeared. Jasmine decided not to let the evening script her reaction. She finished her service, cleared a cocktail table with the steady hands of someone who had learned to disassemble problems into plates and trash. Her manager, Luis, leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" He was a man with kind eyes and a tattoo of a compass on his wrist, someone who carried a geography of many shifts. She nodded. "I'm fine." The words were small, and in them something practical. She was not fine the way a preserved thing is fine. She was fine the way a person is fine who needs a plan. That plan required two pieces: the proof and the audience. She would not call the press herself. That would be melodrama. She would not storm the stage at the next fundraiser either. That would be spectacle. Instead, she filled the recorder with the evening's audio and saved it under a folder named clinically Microag Summer. Her fingers moved with the fatigue of someone who kept making lists and checking them off. The ball concluded as planned for most. The Hartwells made a brief toast. Their smiling faces were published in the society pages the next morning. The cameras caught Victoria's hand in a candid that could be read a dozen ways. The public, used to the polished narratives, absorbed, scanned, and filed away. But the phone shared across a dozen hands would become a different kind of engine. If you want to see how this unfolds, how a single recorded night turns into something larger, subscribe. Stay if you want the full fallout and to watch how dignity forces its own reckoning. After the canned applause and the signature cocktails, the ball bleached the night into a sort of afterimage. Jasmine lingered in the lobby, the place where the public elements of the event dissolved into the private logistics of a staff who had to clean up, restock, and go home to real lives. The hotel's marble floor held an echo of heels and the faint smell of citrus from the bar. A bellman rolled a cart of wrapped gifts. A few lingering guests hooded their coats against the snow. It was here, in this in-between space, that Robert found her. At first, his face held the half-formed expression of a man who had discovered a scratched plate in a kitchen he had never inspected. He approached not with the arrogance of the social elite, but with the tentative stiffness of someone who'd stepped into a scene he didn't understand. "Miss Washington?" he asked, name falling like an attempt at properness. She looked up. She could have withdrawn the recorder and hidden it behind her palm, but it was already visible to anyone who watched closely, small, non-threatening. She gave him her name as she gave her truth, plainly, without argument. Jasmine Washington. He frowned, searching his memory for where she fit into his curated life. He stopped.
He measured the sentence, like a man who had rehearsed his apologies and found them insufficient. He had watched much of the exchange, but not the private mechanics of the wash in the kitchen. He had seen the smear and the gesture, and it had lodged somehow in his chest. "What happened out there," he began, then corrected. "What you endured out there was not right." She could have accepted that phrasing and let it be the salve some men offer themselves. She had heard the tone before. Sympathetic, yes, but also a shield. She knew the shape of words men like Robert used at charity galas. They felt warm. They did not touch the hard work. So she did something she'd been saving for opportunities tied to leverage. "I recorded the exchange," she said, plain. She let the recorder slide into her palm and clicked play, offering a dispassionate window into the room's sound. The clip was short. The laughter, Victoria's crisp voice, the tearing sound pulled into a small, compressed moment. Robert stood still as the audio played. His jaw worked. He listened as the room, which had smoothed itself back into celebration, reconstituted as culpability. "You recorded it," he said, which was not a question, but a recognition that the world did not run the way it used to for men in suits. In the era of devices and feeds, evidence could travel beyond the ballroom and into living rooms, into boardrooms where reputations lived and could be recalibrated. He could see that now. "I've been collecting statements," Jasmine said. She nodded toward the recorder, and then, because she had learned that dignity required assertion as much as patience, she added, "I'm finishing my MBA. My thesis is on microaggressions and workplace culture. I think what happened tonight is not an isolated incident."
The words landed with the weight of a professional file. They rearranged the scene. For Robert, they were something like a levered truth. Jasmine was not merely a server. She was an analyst of the conditions that made a torn dress into a spectacle. She had the vocabulary to name the harm and the documentation to show it. He swallowed. Hartwell Development could use someone who understands that, he said before he could weigh it, a line that surprised even him with its bluntness. It was not a promise. It was an observation that had the flavor of an offer. Jasmine did not allow herself to be dazzled. She knew the steps that often followed such words, assurances softened into committees, initiatives diluted into glossy brochures. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I want a platform to make change that lasts. If you're serious about improving culture at Hartwell, about not just responding to optics, I have a plan. It's about policy, training, and measurable accountability. It's not about firing one person. It's about changing systems that allow people like her to think they can do things like that and be applauded." Robert's eyes narrowed as if suddenly adjusting the focus.
He had been an architect of projects that shifted skylines. He had not thought enough about the internal topography of his own organization. The notion that a qualitative, measured approach, data, audits, structures, might save more than a press release had been in the periphery of his mind, but never its center. Jasmine had thrust it into the center with the authority of someone who had worked through it in class, fieldwork, and life. "I can't promise anything tonight," he said. "Careful now. But we can talk, privately. I'd like to hear your plan." Jasmine folded that into her ledger. She weighed the risk, a meeting with a man whose influence could reshape narratives, but also a meeting in which words might become nothing. She thought of the recorder at her side. She thought of the months of nights she had worked and the thesis that had cost her more than tuition, time, sleep, the steady erasure that microaggressions inflicted. She had spent a year building graphs and interview transcripts that showed how patterns produce outcomes. She had hard data that could map personal cruelty onto measurable institutional damage. Before she could answer, Victoria's laugh, bright and rehearsed, sliced through the foyer. She appeared at the top of the lobby steps like an empress discovering something menial. Her eyes narrowed in that way people's eyes narrow when their illusions about their dominion are tested. She had seen her husband linger in the doorway. She had seen how the conversation might seed a narrative that could make headlines about her. She stepped down the stairs, silk whispering, a smile fixed, her presence sweeping into the frame. "Robert," she said, honeyed, the kind of voice that could blanch a board's minutes. She looked at Jasmine with a tolerance that was nearly worth a coin. "What are you doing talking to the help? Are you soliciting opinions now?" It was a small, rhetorical question designed to cut. Margaret and Patricia materialized at her side, smiling the way people smile when they're ready to sign a petition of solidarity with power. One of them tapped a decorative cuff, the motion like punctuation. "We thought this was a night of celebration," Patricia offered, as if charity could close the scene. Jasmine met Victoria's gaze. She could have been consumed by the familiar pit of anger. Instead, she felt a cool, practical focus, like the clarity before a chess move. This was the moment where the story could be reframed. If Robert retreated, the evening's texture, the smear, the tear, would be swallowed by the social maw. If he engaged, even enough to listen, he might be the hinge upon which the evening tilted. Robert straightened. The presence of his wife, the public expectation that he avoid the embarrassment of a private misdeed becoming an institutional issue, pressed on him. Victoria's expression was the practiced one of someone without consequences in mind. He felt the sudden gravity of a choice. Shield the social order in which his family benefited, or acknowledge the harm and perhaps unsettle his world. He looked at Jasmine again. "Can we talk in my office tomorrow?" he asked. The words were careful, not yet an offer, not yet an action. They were a footstep toward responsibility. Jasmine heard both the tentative apology and the opportunity in them. Victoria's mouth tightened into a line. She stepped closer and, as if to reclaim the narrative, said to Robert with a glance that included the crowd and the cameras that would be waiting for anything they could be fed, "Everything's fine. It was a misunderstanding." Her voice was moderate. Her posture was wounded by the notion of being questioned. But her hand, the one that had torn the dress a few hours before, now smoothed her own gown in a motion of controlled ferocity. It was a final performative act. Reassert the story that nothing was wrong and watch the room bend to agreement. "Not everything is fine," Robert said. His voice surprised him with its solidity. "Not if someone's dignity is being used as entertainment." He had said it quietly enough that the rest of the lobby might not hear, but Margaret's lips thinned and Victoria's jaw clenched. The pivot was public and private at once. In that small exchange, the possibility of an institutional response, data-driven, procedural, inconvenient to social rituals, had been born. Jasmine looked down at her hands and felt the recorder's casing warm from her grip. She had little patience for theatrics. She had data. She had hours of interviews for her thesis that spoke of slow attrition, people sidelined by assumptions, passed over by committees that could not see them as leaders. She had charts and names and a methodology. And she had, momentarily, a man whose company had the power to implement structural changes. Victoria spoke again, this time directed not at Robert but at the room. We all have to be careful about what we record and what we accuse in public. Do we want our holidays ruined by claims? She let the sentence trail in a way that suggested not hate, but a moral discomfort with being caught. Victoria's meaning was clear. She was positioning herself as the injured party, the one whom the public might soon sympathize with if she could tell the story first. She was, after all, skilled at narrative. Her social capital had hedges. Robert glanced at Victoria. He felt for the first time the weight of the office he carried and the potential of the choices it required. There were PR teams to consult and legal counsel that would counsel caution. There was also the possibility that a swift internal audit, done transparently and with teeth, might prevent the slow rot that allowed incidents like the one tonight to happen again. He thought of the blank lines corporate reports left where human dignity should be recorded.
"Tomorrow," he said finally, turning back to Jasmine, and in that word something like a future leaned forward. "My assistant will arrange it. I want to hear your plan." The foyer's echo seemed to hold that sentence longer than the others. For a sliver of a breath, the possibility of change was not merely a slogan. It sat in the room like a demand. Victoria's smile faltered, then settled into a careful, practiced version of itself. She reached for the narrative she preferred, the one that protected her social capital. Yet there was a tiny tremor in the corners of her eyes, not pain but calculation. If university credentials and the frame of institutional reform were brought into the public, her action could become a headline with consequences for membership on boards, invitations, and the small economies of favor she traded in. Jasmine nodded almost imperceptibly. She did not celebrate. She filed the moment into a category she labeled opportunities. She had learned not to count blessings until they were formatted and signed. She had also learned that dignity was not a private commodity. It required defense in public forums. The recorder in her palm was more than a device. It was a ledger. When Robert turned and walked back into the aftermath of the event, Victoria followed him a step behind, her posture the same carved civility she put on for photographs. Margaret and Patricia clustered around her like a court of small attentions. The staff began the quiet work of wiping tables and stacking chairs. The orchestra packed its sheet music. Only the marble remembered the detail of the smear. Jasmine stayed for a moment longer. She looked down at her apron, at the small fold she had made to conceal the tear. She thought about her mother sitting by the window in a small flat in the South End, waiting for the call that told her everything was balanced for another month. She thought about the months of reading, the nights cataloging data, the peers who had dismissed her thesis as academic navel-gazing. She had the evidence now. She had a man's tentative willingness to engage. But she also knew institutions were slow, and the work she had to do would be the measured, persistent labor of policy and proof. She gathered her things and walked out into the cold. Snow had begun to settle in the streetlights, laying a soft hush over the city's noise. The night smelled of wet asphalt and spent cheer. She made her way, steady, toward the tea station, toward the longer life she hoped to build. In the pocket of her apron, the recorder warmed against her hip like a heartbeat. Later that night, in an apartment with thin walls and thicker resolve, Jasmine would pull the audio into her laptop, label it, and add it to the corpus she had been building. She would transcribe phrases without parroting slurs, noting tone and interruption, and the way the room folded up like a map to hide the harm done.
She would write up a short memo, an executive summary meant not for virality, but for institutional ears, that translated humiliation into risk. She would check her email for the human smallness of a mother's text. "Did you eat? Are you okay?" She would answer in the only way she knew to be honest and hopeful. "I'm working on it." And somewhere, in a drawing room not far from where she cleaned up, Victoria would pour herself another glass and rehearse the faces she would make for cameras and for apology committees. She would call the socialites who tethered her to invitations and measure with a practiced hand the distance between scandal and exile. She would not yet see the full arc of how a recorded night can ripple outward, how a clip, a strategic release, public will, and corporate appetite for damage control can combine to create a momentum that does not bend under the weight of pedigree. That binding had not yet occurred. The audio sat dormant on Jasmine's device. The decision that Robert might make was not yet made. The night closed around these things like a page being turned. The torn dress remained, a small ruin at the center of a glittering hall. But the tear was no longer only a wound. It had also become evidence, a fulcrum. People would take positions, gossip would breed its own truth, and in quiet places, plans would be drafted with the care of architects, metrics, benchmarks, audits, and the slow geography of reform. For now, the story paused on the thin edge of possibility, an offer that was not yet an agreement, an audio that had not yet gone public, and a woman who, for the first time in many rooms, had been seen as someone who could shape systems rather than merely serve them. The city slept under a dusting of snow, unaware that one night in a ballroom would set into motion a chain reaction that would test where true accountability lived, in the courts of social opinion, in corporate boardrooms, or in the persistent, methodical work of someone with an MBA, a recorder, and the grit to turn personal injury into structural change. The next morning, the city felt smaller, as if the previous night's sparkle had been filed away into evidence folders. Jasmine woke with the memory of silk under her fingers and the recorder warm against her hip. She breathed in the cramped air of her apartment, pushed a stray hair behind her ear, and opened her laptop. The file named Micro-Ag Summer sat in the folder she had created for months. Interviews, transcripts, notes, pattern charts. She listened again, less for shock than for the architecture of sound. The tear, the laugh, the soft chorus of bystanders who chose to look away. Her phone buzzed with a message from Robert's assistant. His office would like to meet her at 10. There was no flourish, no PR team's press release one-liner. A calendar invitation slid into her schedule, practical as an invoice.
She closed the laptop and dressed with the economy of someone who planned for movement, a practical coat, shoes that could weather the city. When she stepped outside, the snow had been brushed into clean berms along the curb, the city already moving into its weekday rhythm. At the Hartwell building, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and the kind of expensive coffee that tries to disguise itself as warmth. Robert met her with a face that had sleep in its eyes and gravity in its jaw. He led her into a conference room with glass walls and a view that flattened the distant skyline into tidy rectangles. The desk was long, and papers were arranged as if someone had been rehearsing restraint. She placed her small recorder on the polished table between them like a quiet emblem. They did not start with theater. Robert listened while she outlined what she wanted: a short-term consulting contract with specific deliverables, authority to conduct an independent audit, protection for staff who might speak to her, a public commitment to act on findings within a set timeline. She asked for a budget and a clause that ensured a direct reporting line to the board for her final recommendations. She did not ask for headline titles. She asked for tools. Robert read the list as if assessing the blueprints of a building he had helped design. "This is rigorous," he said, and the sentence landed with the relief of being recognized as work rather than complaint. He did not say it would be easy. He did say the company would fund the effort and that he would keep his word about arranging the meetings. His voice was careful. "I can't promise the board will accept everything," he said, "but I can promise you this: I'll open the doors you need." Opening doors meant someone in the Hartwell orbit would find the audio. The clip surfaced not from Jasmine's hand, but from the press's, a short, compressed segment and a hastily transcribed threat. The initial uploader was anonymous. The first accounts to share it were small and pointed: a local reporter who received a tip, a host of activists who went through the mess of screenshots and comments the morning after. Within hours, the clip had seeded 1,000 conversations, on news sites, in group chats, on feeds. The city's morning shows threaded the small soundbite between studio lights. Jasmine learned the audio had leaked the way most people do in a connected age: a friend's message, a link that folded open into another world. She had not authorized it. She had not wanted spectacle. But the leak had the particular force of truth made visible. People who had once been part of private parties found themselves aligning in public. The narrative Victoria had been shaping, that it was an unfortunate incident, misread gestures, a misstep, shriveled in the bright light of recorded sound.
Victoria's initial response read as damage control, a carefully worded apology that functioned like a Band-Aid, soft at the edges and unwilling to touch the wound. She framed the episode as an unfortunate misunderstanding and asked for privacy. She used the language of regret without meaningful acknowledgement. Her social pages filled with polished photos and carefully arranged captions. Her circle rallied with predictable vows of forgiveness that read as rehearsed absolution. Meanwhile, the clip multiplied.
People watched the string of gestures again and again, and each replay carved more public awareness into the night's pattern. The reaction was not monolithic. Some people reacted with outrage, others with a defensive reflex that confuses discomfort with persecution. Columnists wrote about the dynamics of hosting and hospitality. Podcast hosts debated whether a single clip could unmoor decades of reputation. But the dominant chord was clear. There was a pattern here, and a recording made the pattern undeniable. Hartwell Development's board called a meeting. Executives texted and deleted. PR teams drafted statements that got softer and softer by the hour. Contracts were annotated. Private donors whispered. Sponsors scanned their risks. For a company that had long prided itself on placid confidence, the leak behaved like a live current under a marble floor. Robert, clear-eyed now, made a different calculation than the one his PR team drafted. This was not only about optics. He understood that institutional inertia had allowed behaviors that should have been policed by culture, not only by policy. Jasmine watched the swell and kept working. She met with staff in small, closed rooms, not as a spectacle, but as someone trying to build a method. She held one-on-one conversations with employees who asked to speak off the record. She read personnel files, redactions and all, charting patterns of promotion, performance reviews, and attrition. She asked for exit interviews, and where the company had none, she created one. Her audit was a slow, methodical mapping of systems where small indignities accumulated into lost careers. Not everyone welcomed her. There were board members who bristled at the implications. One of them, a longtime friend of Victoria's, suggested in a call that perhaps the firm should issue an apology and move on. "We have a lot at stake," he warned. "We can't overturn social capital on the hearing of a moment." His language was frank. It smelled of ledgers and event calendars. But Robert had tasted the discomfort of the night, and whatever else had compelled him, image, conscience, or fear, he was moving differently. As pressure grew externally, some of Victoria's allies took it upon themselves to craft counter-narratives. A crisis firm pitched a staged reconciliation. A lawyer suggested a demand for retractions and threatened suits for defamation if the clip continued to be shared.
Victoria's public persona split into two tracks: the carefully curated image she posted and the growing tide of private messages, members resigning from committees, charities reconsidering fundraising chairs, a country club quietly removing her from a leadership list. Memberships that once circulated invitations now had clauses about reputational risk. Sponsors calculated whether their logos could ride beside an embattled name. For Jasmine, the viral moment was not the goal. It was leverage. But leverage is a double-edged tool. With visibility came scrutiny. People looked for motivations and found a complex picture. A young woman with real credentials and real stakes. A city hungry for reckoning. A corporation with assets at risk. Some critics accused her of playing for cameras, while others lionized her as a symbol of overdue accountability. She had to navigate those narratives while keeping the work precise. Luis, her manager at the hotel, was not anonymous in the way the city spoke of influencers. He was a steady presence in Jasmine's life. He called her that week with a voice made protective. "I tried to stop it," he said quietly, meaning the leak. "But after what I saw, after what you showed me privately, I felt I couldn't just sit." He had given the clip to a reporter he trusted. He hadn't meant fame for Jasmine. He had meant an insistence that management and guests stop acting like such things could be swept into the dustbin of polite conversation. Jasmine felt a sting when she learned how the audio had reached the public. Her instincts had been for documentation used in institutionally sanctioned ways, an audit, board briefings, a careful binding plan. But she also felt a practical clarity. The leak had accelerated a timeline and forced actors into decisions. She accepted the present with the pragmatism she had used at the ball: arrange, record, proceed. The board's first public response was moderate. Hartwell Development released a statement that promised a thorough review and commitment to inclusive workplace environments. Phrases like zero tolerance and ongoing evaluation populated the paragraphs, but the language was too general for the moment. Jasmine insisted on specifics: timelines, independent audits, external advisors, and protections for whistleblowers. She negotiated fiercely for autonomy: no diluting committees, no hollow-sounding task forces. Her first deliverable was a diagnostic, an independent audit that would surface both explicit complaints and the invisible patterns of exclusion. Jasmine assembled a small team: 2 external consultants with experience in organizational change, a data analyst who could translate HR records into charts, and an anonymous hotline manager to ensure staff could speak without fear. She insisted that the audit include qualitative interviews as well as quantitative analysis. The stories needed to be able to meet the statistics. Resistance crept in where it always does. People mistaken stability for virtue. A senior executive muttered in a corridor about overreach. Another wondered aloud whether such measures would create hostility where none exists. Jasmine listened, catalogued remarks, and filed them under patterns. She knew this was slow labor. Systems do not bend under a clip. They yield to sustained pressure and structural change. Victoria, meanwhile, pivoted into a different mode, grievance. She gave an interview to a society magazine in which she framed herself as a figure who had been misread and misjudged. She expressed regret without repentance and lamented the toxicity of modern outrage. The piece read like a defense against tides she did not choose to navigate. Her social calendar thinned as organizations deliberated. Invitations were rescinded privately. Charity boards accepted margins of risk she could not offset. The public consequence in this fictional arc was tangible but not cinematic. It was a slow unwinding. Hartwell Development removed her from a foundation board. 2 charitable organizations distanced themselves. A piece of social real estate, an honorary chair of a local gala, reconsidered her presence. People who had once sat beside her at lunches now avoided her calls. She did not fall in a day, but the air around her cooled. It was not justice as vengeance. It was reputational currency evaporating under scrutiny. Robert chose a narrow path that startled some of his peers. He issued a statement acknowledging that the company needed to do more than perform virtue. He pledged resources and invited Jasmine to lead the audit. He did not apologize for being complicit. He acknowledged discomfort and offered action. For many, his choice read like the compromise of a man trying to retrofit ethics into a career built on optics. For Jasmine, it was the opportunity she had asked for. The audit's findings were hard for some executives to read, and harder for them to argue against. It mapped promotion gaps across gender and race. It traced patterns of language in performance reviews that correlated with stalled careers. It showed a pipeline thinner than the company claimed. Jasmine's report was not a screed. It was graphs and interviews and redacted timelines. It proved that small harms aggregate into structural exclusion. At the first board meeting where she presented the audit, the room was colder than the lobby had been the night of the ball. There were faces aligned with the old order. There were younger members who had recommended reforms for years. Jasmine spoke without flourish. She showed charts that traced attrition rates, highlighted recurring phrases in reviews, and outlined a plan with measurable benchmarks: transparent promotion criteria, anonymous reporting systems, mandatory training with external accountability, a 5-year mentorship pipeline, and an annual public report audited by an independent firm.
Change is not about punishing a person, she said simply. It's about changing the systems that make such behavior possible. The sentence landed in a room uncomfortable with its own complacency. The board debated. There were legal cautions, there were concerns about costs, but there was also an emerging public appetite for accountability. The leak had shifted the room's center of gravity. A majority agreed to the measures, but not without caveats. Some insisted on softened language. Jasmine pushed back on dilution at every turn. She had insisted earlier in the week that this work be about measurable outcomes, not performative press releases. Victoria watched these developments like someone watching from a high window as a city rearranged below. She pursued reputation management, lawyers, PR, a few defensive interviews. She did not understand that reputations are not only defended by statements, but rebuilt by consistent action. Her social circuit narrowed, so did the choir that had once amplified her voice. In private, she asked friends for support. They offered polite condolence that kept real accountability at arm's length. As Hartwell Development implemented changes, small victories appeared. Anonymous reporting channels filled. A cohort of mid-level employees, managers who had been passed over, were invited to participate in mentorship programs. The company instituted transparent criteria for promotion, asking managers to demonstrate how decisions aligned with objective markers of performance. Trainings were not a one-off lecture, but part of a curriculum paired with measurable outcomes and real consequences for sustained poor behavior. Jasmine's role shifted from consultant to architect. She trained teams, readjusted job descriptions, and pushed for metrics that would survive leadership changes. People came to her, nervous and relieved. Employees who had felt invisible now had a place to put their stories where they would be heard and measured. Jasmine insisted on audits every 6 months, on public reports that would make progress visible. She guarded against the trap she had seen before: one-off trainings, glossy reports, committees that convened without teeth. She wanted what she had demanded in the conference room: systemic change. Resistance did not vanish. There were attempts to discredit her work, selective leaks, anonymous op-eds questioning motives, but the data held. The numbers did not care for smear campaigns. When a 2-page brief misrepresented one of her interviews, Jasmine corrected the record and produced the raw transcripts. Her insistence on methodology made it harder for critics to turn facts into opinions. The city watched.
The viral clip that had started the chain remained the artifact everyone returned to, but what followed mattered more. Policy memos, board votes, the stories of employees who were now given the space to build careers instead of being sidelined by micro-insults.
Hartwell Development began to publish annual diversity reports, complete with targets and independent verification. It was not a perfect pivot. Long-standing culture shifts take time, but it was measurable, and it was public. Victoria retreated into a narrower orbit. Invitations that once signaled belonging were replaced by press inquiries and the persistent echo of social media commentary. She continued to host dinners in smaller circles and issued statements that read like exercises in damage control. People who had once queued to host her found their calendars open. The social ecology that had nurtured her cruelty started to reorganize without her at the center. For Jasmine, the tide did more than change a company. It changed her life. She was offered a permanent role at Hartwell Development, Director of Inclusive Initiatives, a title that came with a staff, a budget, and a mandate to keep the company accountable. She negotiated the position to include an independent review board and scholastic partnerships, ways to ensure the work would not evaporate if leadership changed. Her acceptance was not triumphal, it was practical. She took the job on terms that protected her independence and ensured that the changes would outlast headlines. She insisted on a clause that codified her reporting to an independent oversight committee and required the company to release semi-annual updates. It was governance as guardrail. Months later, her mother sat in the front row of a small auditorium at the university where Jasmine had finished her studies. The room smelled of coffee and the book dust of commencement seasons. Jasmine had completed her MBA, and this time the degree felt like a ledger balanced. She had turned humiliation into tenure. She stood at a podium with a stitched-up sleeve in the memory of a torn dress and spoke to the crowd with the tempered cadence of someone who understood both injury and method. Her speech did not cast stones. It mapped, instead, a path from indignity to design. She told the story of the night not as theater, but as a case study, of how evidence can make patterns legible, of how institutions can be compelled to change when proof is paired with strategy, and how dignity requires both courage and craft. She spoke of the small mechanisms, anonymous reporting, transparent promotion metrics, mentorship pipelines, that together created a system less hospitable to casual cruelty. You cannot reform culture with slogans alone, she said. You need policy that charts outcomes and structures that make accountability durable. She laid out concrete examples, the anonymous hotlines, the mentorship pairings, the public metrics. Her voice was soft but firm. She announced a scholarship fund she was starting in her mother's name to support low-income students pursuing business degrees. The fund would focus on those who, like her, navigated work and study at once. It was not a gesture of victory, it was a tool for sustaining opportunity.
The scholarship became a small extension of the audit she'd initiated, a way to seed future leaders who would not be defined by the small violences of others. She also launched a modest training program for other corporations, built on Hartwell's nascent model, data-driven, externally audited, and tied to measurable career outcomes. Harvard Business School used parts of her audit as a case study in a course on organizational change, and professors remarked on the clarity of the methodology: story backed by data, action backed by governments. Victoria watched these developments from a distance. Invitations dwindled further. One of the club boards that had once numbered her among its luminaries quietly removed her name from a philanthropic roster. No public shaming followed, instead a slow erasure, fewer mentions in social pages, fewer photo opportunities. Her reputation, long built on the inertia of privilege, found itself negotiated anew by groups wary of the costs of ignoring accountability. There was no melodramatic collapse. There was instead an unspooling. Dinners unbooked, calls unanswered, the tiny economics of favor atrophy. It was consequenced not by spectacle, but by the sober logic of reputational risk, and that, in the life of the city's social circuits, is often the most stable form of accountability. Robert's relationship with his wife shifted. In public, the couple maintained a series of cautious statements that emphasized personal reflection and professional boundaries. Where they once performed unity seamlessly, there were now pauses, public gaps that signaled recalibration. He remained a figure of influence, but his willingness to back structural change had altered his social posture. He did not erase his association with privilege, but he used it, imperfectly, to advance policies that held people to account. Jasmine's life was not without strain. Leading change required time she had not assumed she would have. There were days when she bit back exhaustion, and nights when critics accused her of using tragedy for career gain. But the numbers and the people who found a place on new career paths kept her steady. She corresponded with employees who had been promoted under the new criteria. She read emails from interns who said they could see a way forward. The cumulative effect of those small wins was the scaffold of real transformation. The city absorbed the sequence of events as it does with many public dramas. Some would remember the viral clip. Others would recall the changes Hartwell Development published in their annual report. Still others would forget entirely. For Jasmine, what mattered was that small indignities no longer had to be endured without record. For the company, what mattered was that a model had been created that could be replicated. Policy married to transparency.
In time, courses at business schools cited the Hartwell case as an example of accountability in motion, a recorded act, an institutional willingness to respond, and a set of reforms that reframed how talent was assessed. Jasmine lectured occasionally on panels, never as a celebrity, but as a practitioner. She continued to study, to teach, and to move within rooms with far less need to make herself small. Victoria's fate was quieter than the tabloids had predicted. She retreated into smaller gatherings and increasingly private life. There was no public spectacle to crown her downfall, no vindictive reveal. Her consequence was the slow loss of invitation and the daily negotiation of a diminished social currency. In private, she called old friends and discovered how fragile the courtesies of favor could be when tested by public scrutiny. The final scene of this arc was not a courtroom or a public shaming. It was a graduation auditorium where a young woman spoke to a crowd and announced a scholarship named for her mother. It was a boardroom where a company published data that had once been hidden. It was a small office where a woman who had been a server now managed an audit team, and the city's press talked about structural change rather than scandal. It was, in other words, the steady work of a life reoriented. There was irony in the fact that a torn dress had set these things in motion. The act was cruel and petty, and made public, yes, but its exposure revealed something more, that dignity, when defended with evidence and strategic patience, can force a reckoning. Jasmine's recorder, a small, unassuming device, had done what courage alone sometimes cannot. It made the pattern legible. What followed required more than outrage. It required governance. The moral of the story was not that the powerful always get punished, or that virtue is rewarded in equal measure. It was that institutions can be nudged, under pressure and with proof, to change. It was that a single act of humiliation need not be the last word. And it was that dignity, applied patiently and with rigor, shapes outcomes more reliably than spectacle. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more narratives where dignity beats privilege.